Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Station F. It's a huge honor for us to have you here today. Welcome back to live events. We get a round of applause for live events. Almost feels weird. So welcome to our third edition. This is actually our third edition. We were actually thinking it was our second one because last year we had one, but it was all online. Today's hybrid. This is F for Femme, our conference on gender diversity to highlight incredible female entrepreneurs and women giving incredible contributions to technology. Today you will get a chance to hear from 15 different speakers, including a woman who was the first French and European woman in space, and a woman who made key contributions to the COVID-19 vaccine, and a whole bunch of other incredible stories. I hope you guys are as excited about that as I am. Before we get started, I would like to show you also the QR code, the famous QR code, to make this as interactive as possible today. Please go ahead and scan that now. That is how you can ask questions throughout all of the different panels and speakers that you will see. We'll take about 5 minutes at the end of every session for questions. If you want to share on social, which we hope you will, please use the hashtag F4Femme. And of course, because this is a live event, don't do everything online. Try and meet each other, talk to people. That's what we're here for in this room. So we're going to have a coffee break at 4 p.m. and a cocktail at 6 p.m. I hope you guys will stick around till the end and actually talk to each other live and in person now that we can. All right. Well, I hope you will help me in welcoming our first speaker on stage. This is Tracy Chou. Please give her a very warm welcome. Thanks, everyone. Got a little extra music in there. So welcome, Tracy. It's great to have you with us.
It's very exciting to be here.
You are a very powerful voice in the diversity space, but also an engineer and the CEO and founder of Block Party. We're going to get a chance to talk about all of that. Let's actually start off with Block Party. Anti-harassment startup. Not a lot of stuff happening in the anti-harassment space, and I'm going to come to that just after. But for people who don't actually know what Block Party is, how it works, why don't you give us an intro fresher course?
Sure. So Block Party is building consumer tools for online safety and anti-harassment. Right now we're on Twitter. We want to expand to other platforms. The way the product works right now is you would sign up for Block Party, link your Twitter account, set filtering rules, and then Block Party just works in the background to clean up your Twitter experience. And so for the folks who are using Block Party now, they'll often describe it as saving their mental health, allowing them to do what they want to do without seeing all the crappy stuff. But because Block Party still keeps a copy of everything that has been filtered, kind of like a spam folder, it allows people to still go and review that content later. In the cases that something was over-filtered and you want to go look at it later, or in the less good scenario when things are really bad and you need to be aware of any threats, you still need to be able to see that. So it was built out of a lot of personal experience in having to deal with online harassment and knowing sort of mental health impact of seeing all this stuff. I think most people can imagine, like, when somebody had said something awful to you, whether or not it was applicable or something that you should even take to heart, it still kind of throws you off and makes you feel bad. And so a lot of our product was built with that in mind, thinking about how do we help people to not have that negative experience, be able to get the positive out of social media without the downsides of it, but also still factoring in what are the things that you do need to know, and also other things like the FOMO of, like, if you filter things out, like, what if you can't see it later? So yeah, that is kind of like the main goal right now is filtering out harassment, but the broader picture is allowing people to be able to go online and participate in online society safely and be able to have voice and not feel like they're being silenced because of all the abuse and harassment coming their way.
Super, a very powerful mission. Definitely not enough being done in this space. I think you probably agree with me, and we'll come to the why in just a second. But I imagine, someone like you must have seen something, experienced something that made you go, this is a problem, I need to spend my time working. What was that moment for you? What did you see, what did you experience that made you think, I need to address this problem?
there's kind of a long build up to it in all the harassment that I have experienced, so it is a very personal experience. Everything from kind of the garden variety sexism and trolling that I think as a woman with any kind of profile online you tend to get, and I get an elevated amount of it, I think, from doing diversity and inclusion work and talking about progressive issues, I suppose. There's all that kind of like normal trolling, all the way up to really targeted harassment and stalking that I've had to deal with. So to the level of having to go to the police and file reports and talk to security firms. So that whole range of dealing with this problem. I also have worked at a number of social media companies, so I was quite early at Facebook, at Quora, and at Pinterest. So I think I know of the ways that we can try to mitigate this with technology. So it's both that kind of personal passion from many, many years of dealing with this, as well as I think the engineering and product insight that I can bring to it. But specifically right before I started Block Party, I was dealing with a couple of more severe incidents where I tried to go through the normal reporting channels to get the accounts taken down, and had every single one of those reports on Twitter, Instagram, et cetera, turned back saying this is not harassment, but thank you for reporting and helping to make our community warm and welcoming, which was a little bit frustrating. And I took screenshots of these and posted them on my personal Facebook, and my friends who work at these companies escalated internally with their trust and safety teams and got the accounts taken down, which actually made me maybe even more annoyed that I could have special access because I happen to know people who work at these companies. And it shouldn't be that way at all. Like, everybody should be able to have a safe experience. It shouldn't just be if you have privileged access, if you know people, or if you're higher profile so you can get a little more attention. So that felt very wrong to me. And then the other piece of it was in dealing with one of these more severe incidents, I had gone to talk to a security firm, and one of the pieces of advice they gave me was it can feel very frustrating when you feel like you're helpless and you can't do anything when somebody is trying to attack you. But sometimes it helps to flip the perspective and maybe try to occupy the mindset of the person who is attacking so you can be proactive in thinking about how you defend. And for me, building Block Party is a way of taking that agency and feeling empowered to try to do something about the problem. It is very frustrating still to have to deal with the harassment, but the silver lining of it is that it's this firsthand user research that goes directly into building the product.
Super, that's an incredible kind of path that you've gone through to do what you do today. When we heard the laughter in the room, I think it means that other people have experienced something similar and they know what we're talking about. Now I want to come to essentially why you feel, or do you feel actually, that there's not enough being done and why that would be. Or is there actually a lot being done that we're not seeing?
I do not think there is enough being done. I think the reason why there isn't enough being done and why there aren't more people working on it is largely lack of diversity. Lack of diversity amongst the people who could build solutions, and lack of diversity amongst the people who could fund the people building solutions. I also think a large part of the reason why we're in this situation now where online abuse and harassment, all these other harms are quite prevalent, the reason why we're in this situation now is also related to this. Amongst the engineers, designers, product managers initially building these platforms, there just wasn't enough representation from people of marginalized identities or from these communities that probably could have foreseen and prioritized building in safeguards or designing things in a different way altogether. But oftentimes we had very homogenous teams building these products and kind of felt that all of these things, these abuse cases, were edge cases that they didn't need to solve. And even now, amongst people who could build solutions, potential founders, engineers, there still isn't that diversity. And with startups, people are very much drawn to solving the problems that they themselves experience, and often are more successful doing that because there's that personal motivation, that personal understanding, which is not to say that you can't solve a problem that you don't experience, but there's more of a connection to it. And there's just not as many folks amongst the set of potential builders who understand it. And we see this problem as well with the funders, the venture capitalist investors who, again, coming from a pretty homogenous pool, often don't understand the problem personally, don't understand the way the solutions might need to manifest, and often are still skeptical of backing more diverse founders who could solve the problem.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit it on the head as to why diversity is so important. Essentially, this is the kind of result that we see when we don't have diverse teams. I'm just curious, though, because you must have heard this. What do you say to people when they're like, is that really a problem? Like, is online harassment, is that really a problem? Can't you just block the person?
There's many different layers of answers to this. I think the immediate one to like, can't you just block the person is like, right, you could take a reactive step in this one case, but it's a much more prevalent problem. And when it gets to certain volumes, like you can't actually just block it. But I think the bigger picture around online abuse is it's not just about the people that it's targeting, and it is actually quite a few people. It may not be as well represented amongst some of these folks who are asking these questions, but it does target a lot of people, and the effects cascade from there. It's not just for those people. Oftentimes, the people who are being silenced by online abuse because it's so much hate that's being directed their way, it's so much abuse that they decide to take themselves away from these public platforms. The rest of us all miss out on what they're trying to say. They're often the people who we most need to hear from. If you think about the scientists and doctors and public health experts that are trying to lead us through this pandemic, or the climate change activists or the sort of climate activists that are trying to rally us around solutions to climate change. The journalists who are speaking truth to power, oftentimes these folks are the ones who are most getting this harassment and abuse that is trying to silence them. This intersects with marginalization, like other identities, so often it's the female journalists that get the most harassment, female politicians as well. But these are the people whose experiences we most need to hear. And they're ones often who are trying to advocate for change, positive change in the world, identifying what's wrong and what we need to do differently. And so when we allow online abuse to effectively silence the most important voices, like all of us in society are suffering from it. The next piece of it is that it's not just about online abuse where there's a problem. It's really this question of who do we allow to participate in online society when it's no longer separate from just normal society. Like our lives are increasingly online. For anybody who wants to be somebody or be a significant figure, you need to have an online presence, a social media presence. And the truth of it right now is that there are certain people who cannot participate as freely online because of this harassment. And the problem is getting worse. There are many reasons we could speculate as to why, but online harassment has been increasing, and it is something that we need to address for the safe functioning of society.
Super. I'm going to jump on the back of that in just 1 second. We'll open up the questions that you guys are posting via the QR code in just a minute. Tracy, ignore what you see on the screen. So yeah, I think you kind of have mentioned the bigger problem. Now tell me, what do you think, or what are you seeing that's being done that you think we should be paying more attention to?
I think there's a lot of really interesting conversations right now that are happening actually in the regulatory space, which kind of makes sense as we're starting to acknowledge as society how much power the platforms have and how little choice consumers have had, and how that can end up playing out pretty poorly. So I think some of the folks who are on that cutting edge of thinking about what are different frameworks we can use to apply to regulate the social media platforms to ensure that we can uphold these different values that are so important for society, like consumer choice, privacy, that there are paths forward that we can take. So far, I think the social media platforms have been able to hold on to this stance of we're doing the best we can. There's no effective way to regulate us. But I think there are actually paths forward around increased transparency, interoperability, allowing people to choose their own algorithms, where they can have more choice in how they experience these platforms. So I think there's really cool work done at that intersection of people who are technical and understand what is possible to do in terms of regulation, like policymakers, and I'm very excited that Block Party is also playing in this space around giving people more choice around how they interact with Twitter and other social media.
Super. So I'm going to take one of the first questions from the audience. So this is a question, I think, specifically about how Block Party works. What technology do you use to filter the content, and what are the criteria that you're filtering for? Essentially, the nuts and bolts of how it works.
So one thing that's funny about this is often people will assume that we're using artificial intelligence, natural language processing. It's actually much simpler than that. We use heuristics like, when did this person create their account? How many followers do they have? Do they have a profile photo? Are they followed by somebody you follow, the verified user? These kind of like basic heuristics on the user account as opposed to on the content. And it actually works quite well. My academic background is actually in artificial intelligence. When we used to build models, a lot of it was based on domain expertise and figuring out what are the right heuristics. And that's essentially what we've chosen to do here. It gets us to, I would say, like 75, 80% of the solution with almost no work versus building AI models, which would be a lot more work and probably get less far. An interesting comparison point is there was a competitor to Block Party that tried to use an NLP approach, and people tried side by side and found that our heuristics worked far better than these sort of fancy NLP algorithms.
I think this is a question that I think is also similar. It kind of wants to get into the nuts and bolts of like what concretely happens once someone gets filtered. Do they get banned? You know, what happens to them? So I think we'll start with what actually happens, and then I'd also like to hear, what do you think should happen? Should there be more than what's currently happening today?
So right now, the way Block Party works is that we just mute the people that are filtered out, and so you don't have to see their content. But actually, it is still available. Other people can still see it. We make it easy for you to go through later and block all these people if you want to. But we think that a big part of the gain is already just that you don't have to deal with the mental health impact of seeing this. There is somewhat of a follow-on effect in that people sometimes post like in their Block Party or in their Twitter accounts bios saying like, I'm using Block Party to filter, so don't even bother tweeting your harassment at me because I'm not going to see it. You're screaming into the void. So I think there's maybe a little bit of that effect. If you know, if a troll realizes that they can't actually get through to you, it makes it less interesting for them to troll. So that's kind of like the second order effect. The way that I think this problem should be solved more broadly is in creating accountability. And when we talk about accountability, there's a few things to define. Accountability implies that there's some set of rules and that when people break the rules, that there's some kind of punishment for it. Right now, we don't even have a very clear definition of what are the rules. There's different ways you could define rules. Like in offline world, we have laws, and depending on what jurisdiction you're in, there may be different laws that apply. There's also social norms. So even if something is not illegal, if you feel like the people around you are going to judge you for doing something in a weird way, you may not do it. Or if you do it, you'll kind of feel the social ostracization. So I think if we take this analogy over to the online world, we need to start defining what are these rules. The rules that are defined by the platforms are often like very, very lowest common denominator, like very low baselines, like you shouldn't be sending death threats. Those types of rules, like there's a big space between like death threat and like just something I actually want to see. But I think even in that, like those rules that the platforms have set, they're often not enforced. So I think we need to change the rules to be more around like proper functioning of society and creating social norms where it's not okay or expected to just shoot off insults to any other person online that you happen to disagree with. I think we need to change some of those norms, but also around the rules that are a bit stricter, like there should actually be enforcement. What type of punishment people receive, I think, should be have adjusted based on like how bad the rule is that they've broken and how badly have they broken it. In the same way that in civil society offline world, like not everything is going to be punished by the worst possible punishment. Like sometimes you get fines, sometimes it's some amount of jail time, but there should be some kind of like appropriate measure of response. Right now it feels like online there's only the extremes where if you do something wrong and the internet mobs have decided that you need to be punished, and there's very extreme accountability of people losing their jobs, kind of being canceled or not supposed, like they're kind of now been told that they are not supposed to do anything anymore because they did one thing wrong. And I feel like some of this is resulting from a lack of governance, or there's no real understanding or shared understanding of what are the rules, like how should we function as society, and what are the appropriate punishments. And so it feels like mob justice, where people will kind of target somebody that I think needs to be punished and overly punished, whereas in many other cases there's no enforcement at all and people just get away with it. The different ways of creating accountability on social platforms right now are like deplatforming, and in some cases losing write permissions, like maybe you can read but you can't write. I feel like there needs to be a much more comprehensive look at how do we construct online society to match the governance that we need for how complex everything is.
Wow, super. I feel like there's so much to be done, and what you just said, you're absolutely right. Like, there's a huge spectrum, and we have these massive voids that we need to fill and start looking to fill. We don't have another question from the audience, but I want to just tag on to one last question. You mentioned earlier that you feel the problem is getting worse. Why is it getting worse?
I think some of it is that we're just increasingly online. There's more people being connected and feeling like they can connect with anybody else who happens to be online. I think there's effects of the platforms in terms of like radicalization or encouragement to people to behave in more extreme ways, even if it's subconscious. I've noticed, for example, if I post something on Twitter, if I make it a little bit spicy or a little bit more extreme, it gets more engagement. And I think these really subtle cues and reinforcements from the algorithms make us try to be just a little bit more extreme in everything, and that's obviously like one factor. I think during COVID, as people have been forced to be online and also like don't have the normal outlets, and there's a lot of other stresses that come from a big global crisis like the pandemic and other things like climate crisis. As people have these like stresses and pressures, sometimes they'll just go online to channel their frustrations and anger at other people who they don't connect to as much, because online is just an avatar, a name, and it's not the same sort of connection that you might have with a person like you're physically present with. I think there's also just these role models, they're not role models, but people who are figureheads, like they're very prominent in spouting out abuse. And
are you talking about a former president?
Possibly. And I think their behavior also kind of gives license to others to follow in the same form. And when people see that there's not really any repercussions to that action, it kind of further incentivizes the bad behavior.
Super. Well, Tracy, I can't believe that's all the time that we have, but thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Roxanne.